The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the kind that filled spaces where tension hung thick in the air. People shuffled into their seats, adjusting ties, smoothing skirts, or flipping through papers they didn't really need to read. It was a typical morning at the courthouse in downtown Cincinnati, except for one thing: Karoline Leavitt. Karoline stood near the plaintiff's table, her fingers brushing over the stack of documents in front of her. She wasn't tall, nor did she wear flashy suits like some of the other lawyers who strutted around the room. Her brown hair was pulled back neatly into a low ponytail, and her black blazer looked practical rather than expensive. But there was something about the way she carried herself, calm, steady, almost as if she belonged here more than anyone else. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell sat confidently with his team. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a smile that seemed permanently etched onto his face. Everyone knew him. He had won dozens of cases like this one, representing big companies accused of things they swore they hadn't done. Today he represented Crestwood Industries, a manufacturing giant facing allegations of exploiting its workers by refusing to pay overtime and forcing them to work under unsafe conditions. The judge entered then, Judge Harold Grayson, a man known for his sharp tongue and sharper mind. His robe swished as he took his seat behind the bench, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. When his gaze landed on Karoline, he paused for just a moment longer than necessary. Then, leaning forward slightly, he spoke. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "I see you're representing the plaintiffs today." Karoline nodded politely. "Yes, Your Honor." Grayson tilted his head, studying her as though trying to figure out what kind of puzzle piece she might be. "Well, Ms. Leavitt," he continued, his tone light but tinged with amusement, "this is quite the David and Goliath scenario we have here. Are you prepared to take on Mr. Caldwell and his impressive resources?" A ripple of laughter moved through the gallery, soft but noticeable. Some people glanced at each other, smirking. Richard Caldwell leaned back in his chair, exchanging amused looks with his associates. They all knew what Grayson meant, even if they weren't outright. Laughing at Karoline, they were definitely skeptical, but Karoline didn't flinch. She met the judge's gaze steadily, her expression calm. "I am, Your Honor," she replied simply. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no hint of nervousness, just quiet confidence. Grayson raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Very well," he said, settling back into his seat. "Let's proceed." As the formalities began, introductions gave way to opening statements. Richard Caldwell went first, as expected. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease, and addressed the court. His words flowed smoothly, painting Crestwood Industries as a pillar of the community, a company that cared deeply about its employees and followed every rule, to the letter. According to him, the accusations against them were baseless, fueled by disgruntled former workers looking for a payday. When it was Karoline's turn, she rose slowly, pulling her notes closer to her. The courtroom fell silent again, everyone watching to see how this young lawyer would respond to Caldwell's polished performance. Would she stumble? Would she falter under pressure? She didn't. Instead, Karoline began speaking in a clear, measured voice. She talked about fairness, about hardworking men and women who deserved to be treated with dignity. She mentioned names, real people, not just statistics. Daniel Harper, a father of 3 who worked double shifts to provide for his family, only to find out his paycheck didn't reflect those extra hours. Maria Lopez, a single mother whose health suffered because of unsafe machinery she wasn't trained to use properly. These weren't abstract concepts. These were lives affected, dreams deferred. And then, almost casually, Karoline dropped a hint. "Your Honor," she said, glancing briefly at Judge Grayson before turning to the jury, "there's evidence we'll present later that will shed new light on this case. Evidence that suggests Crestwood Industries may not be as transparent as they claim." The comment hung in the air, subtle but deliberate. Richard Caldwell shifted slightly in his seat, his brow furrowing for the first time. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his earlier smirk replaced by curiosity. What kind of evidence could this young lawyer possibly have? For now, though, the details remained hidden. Opening statements concluded and the real battle began. As witnesses took the stand and testimonies unfolded, Karoline listened intently, taking notes in shorthand on her legal pad. She asked thoughtful questions during cross-examinations, never raising her voice but always hitting the right notes. One witness, a middle manager named Paul Evans, admitted under her careful questioning that employees were sometimes discouraged from reporting injuries. Another, a human resources officer named Lisa Bennett, hesitated when asked whether Crestwood had ever investigated complaints about unpaid overtime. Each small victory added up, chipping away at the wall Richard Caldwell had built so carefully. And while the defense still seemed strong, cracks were beginning to show. Back in the gallery, spectators whispered among themselves. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? How was she holding her own against someone like Richard Caldwell? Even Judge Grayson couldn't help but notice. During a recess, as lawyers gathered their materials and the courtroom emptied temporarily, he caught Karoline's eye. "You're doing better than I expected, Ms. Leavitt," he remarked, his tone lighter now, less mocking. Karoline smiled faintly. "Thank you, Your Honor." It wasn't a full endorsement, not yet. But it was enough to signal that she had earned his attention, and maybe even a sliver of respect. By the end of the day, the courtroom felt different. The initial skepticism toward Karoline had softened, replaced by cautious curiosity. People wanted to know more about her strategy, about the mysterious evidence she had hinted at earlier. Even Richard Caldwell seemed a little less sure of himself, though he tried to hide it behind his usual charm. As Karoline packed up her things and prepared to leave, she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. This was just the beginning, she reminded herself. There was still a long road ahead, and nothing was guaranteed. But for now, she had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury, the judge, and even her opponent. And sometimes, that was all it took to start turning the tide. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. The air was heavier, charged with anticipation. People filed in earlier than usual, eager to see how the story would unfold. Karoline Leavitt arrived quietly, her steps steady as she made her way to the plaintiff's table. She carried a folder stuffed with papers, her face calm but focused. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell and his team were already seated, their expressions confident but tinged with something new. Uncertainty. Judge Harold Grayson entered the room, his presence commanding immediate silence. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at both sides before nodding for the proceedings to continue. Today it was Richard Caldwell's turn to call witnesses, and he wasted no time. His first witness was William Hargrove, a senior executive at Crestwood Industries. Tall and well-dressed, Hargrove exuded authority as he took the stand. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, and his tie gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Under Caldwell's guidance, Hargrove painted a picture of efficiency and fairness. He described Crestwood as a company that valued its employees above all else, ensuring they had safe working conditions and fair compensation. "We follow every regulation," Hargrove stated firmly, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Our workers are treated with respect." Karoline watched him closely, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. When it came time for cross-examination, she stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. "Mr. Hargrove," she began, her tone polite but firm, "you mentioned that Crestwood follows all labor regulations. Is that correct?" Hargrove nodded confidently. "Yes, absolutely." Karoline paused, letting the moment settle. Then she asked, "Can you explain why, in March of last year, your company received a warning from the Department of Labor regarding unpaid overtime claims?" The courtroom stirred slightly. Hargrove blinked, caught off guard. I'm not sure about specific incidents," he stammered. "But if there were any issues, they were addressed promptly." "Addressed promptly?" Karoline repeated, raising an eyebrow. According to our records, several employees reported similar complaints after that warning. Were those also addressed promptly? Hargrove shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'd need to review the details, he said, his confidence wavering. I see, Karoline replied softly. She moved on to another line of questioning, probing deeper into discrepancies in payroll records. Each question was sharp, precise, and impossible to evade. By the time she finished, Hargrove looked flustered, his earlier composure shattered. Even Judge Grayson leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Richard Caldwell tried to repair the damage during redirect examination, but the cracks were already visible. As Hargrove stepped down from the stand, murmurs rippled through the gallery. People exchanged glances, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Karoline returned to her seat, her expression unchanged, but inside, she felt a flicker of hope. Later that day, Caldwell called Daniel Harper to testify. Daniel was one of the key whistleblowers in the case, a man who had worked long hours at Crestwood, only to discover his paycheck didn't match his effort. He sat nervously on the stand, fidgeting with his hands as Caldwell began his questioning. Caldwell's approach was aggressive. He attacked Daniel's credibility, suggesting he was bitter about being fired and seeking revenge. Isn't it true, Mr. Harper? Caldwell pressed, his voice sharp, that you were terminated for misconduct? And now you're using this lawsuit as a way to get back at Crestwood? Daniel hesitated, his face reddening. No, that's not true, he mumbled. I worked hard for them. I never did anything wrong. Caldwell smirked, sensing weakness. Then why were you let go, Mr. Harper? Can you explain that? Before Daniel could respond, Karoline objected. Your Honor, she said calmly. Counsel is badgering the witness. Judge Grayson nodded. Sustained. Mr. Caldwell, please refrain from leading the witness. Caldwell shot Karoline a glare but backed off slightly. Still, the damage was done. Daniel looked shaken, unsure how to defend himself against such pointed accusations. It was clear Caldwell intended to paint him as unreliable, someone whose testimony couldn't be trusted. When it was Karoline's turn for cross-examination, she approached Daniel gently. Mr. Harper, she said, her voice warm and reassuring, can you tell us about your experience working at Crestwood? What was a typical day like for you? Daniel relaxed slightly, grateful for the change in tone. It was tough, he admitted. They expected a lot from us. Sometimes I'd work 12, 14 hours a day, especially during busy seasons. But when payday came, my check didn't show those extra hours. Karoline nodded sympathetically. And did you report this to anyone at Crestwood? Yes, Daniel replied. I talked to my supervisor a few times, but nothing changed. They told me to stop complaining or I'd lose my job. The courtroom grew quieter as Daniel spoke. His words resonated with authenticity, painting a stark contrast to Caldwell's earlier portrayal of him as dishonest. Karoline let the silence linger for a moment before asking, How did that make you feel, Mr. Harper? Daniel sighed, looking down at his hands. Frustrated, helpless, like no one cared. Karoline thanked him and returned to her seat, leaving the jury and everyone else in the room to reflect on his testimony. Caldwell's attempt to discredit Daniel had backfired, making the whistleblower appear more human and relatable instead of untrustworthy. As the day wore on, another witness took the stand. Maria Lopez, a former machine operator at Crestwood. Maria was soft-spoken but determined, her dark eyes filled with resolve. Under Karoline's questioning, she described the unsafe conditions she endured daily. Machines broke down frequently, and repairs were delayed because the company wanted to save money. Once, Maria injured her hand while operating faulty equipment, but instead of receiving proper medical care, she was pressured to return to work immediately. And what happened when you complained about the safety issues? Karoline asked gently. Maria hesitated, then said, They told me I was overreact. Backing away from the stand, Karoline allowed the weight of Maria's words to sink in. The courtroom was silent, the atmosphere heavy with emotion. Even Judge Grayson seemed affected, his usual stern demeanor softened by the raw honesty of the testimony. Richard Caldwell tried to counter Maria's account during cross-examination, questioning whether she had followed proper protocols or exaggerated the severity of her injury. But his attempts fell flat. Maria remained composed, answering each question with quiet dignity. By the time she stepped down, there was no denying the impact of her story. The jury members exchanged glances, some scribbling notes furiously, others leaning forward in their seats, visibly moved. As the afternoon session drew to a close, Judge Grayson called for a brief recess. Lawyers gathered their materials, and spectators stretched or whispered among themselves. Karoline stayed seated for a moment longer, reviewing her notes. She knew the day had gone well, better than she had dared to hope. But she also knew the fight was far from over. Richard Caldwell wouldn't give up easily, and he still had plenty of tricks up his sleeve. When the court reconvened, Caldwell called his final witness of the day, Lisa Bennett, the head of human resources at Crestwood. Lisa was polished and professional, her answers rehearsed to perfection. She assured the court that Crestwood had rigorous processes in place to address employee concerns, and that any allegations of wrongdoing were thoroughly investigated. But Karoline wasn't deterred. During cross-examination, she zeroed in on inconsistencies in Lisa's statements. "Ms. Bennett," she asked, her tone neutral but probing, "you mentioned that Crestwood investigates all complaints. Can you provide documentation showing how many complaints were filed last year and how they were resolved?" Lisa hesitated, clearly unprepared for such a direct request. "I'd need to verify those numbers," she said cautiously. "You don't have them readily available?" Karoline pressed, her voice carrying just a hint of skepticism. "No, not at this moment," Lisa admitted, shifting uncomfortably. Karoline let the pause hang in the air before moving on to another topic. "Let's talk about training programs. Did Crestwood offer regular safety training sessions for its employees?" Lisa nodded quickly. "Of course, safety is a top priority." "Interesting," Karoline remarked, pulling out a document from her folder, "because according to this internal memo dated 6 months ago, management decided to cut funding for safety training to reduce costs. Can you explain that decision?" Lisa's face flushed red, and she glanced nervously at Caldwell. I can't comment on specific memos without reviewing them first," she stammered. "I understand," Karoline said smoothly, tucking the memo back into her folder. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett." By the time Lisa left the stand, her confident facade had crumbled. Caldwell looked increasingly frustrated, his earlier swagger replaced by tension. Judge Grayson, meanwhile, observed everything with growing interest. He occasionally jotted down notes, his expression thoughtful. When the judge called an end to the day's proceedings, the courtroom buzzed with conversation. Spectators lingered, discussing the dramatic twists and turns. Reporters huddled near the exit, eager to capture quotes and reactions. Outside, news vans lined the street, cameras rolling as anchors delivered updates on the unfolding drama. Back inside, Karoline packed up her things methodically, her mind already racing ahead to the next phase of the trial. The third day of the trial dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the tension that had settled over the courthouse. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, with spectators arriving early to secure their seats. Reporters crowded near the entrance, microphones in hand, eager to capture any scrap of information they could. Karoline Leavitt arrived quietly, her step steady despite the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She carried a slim folder under one arm, her face calm but focused. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell looked restless. His usually impeccable suit seemed slightly rumpled, as though he hadn't slept well. He whispered urgently to his team, pointing at documents and scribbling notes. It was clear he was strategizing, trying to regain control after the setbacks of the previous day. Judge Harold Grayson entered the room shortly after, his expression unreadable as he took his seat behind the bench. "Let's proceed," he said curtly, signaling for the trial to resume. Today, it was Karoline's turn to call witnesses. Her first witness was Dr. Evelyn Carter, an expert in workplace safety standards. Dr. Carter was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an authoritative presence. As she took the stand, The courtroom fell silent, everyone curious about what she would say. Karoline began by asking Dr. Carter to explain the importance of maintaining safe working conditions. The expert spoke clearly, outlining the risks associated with neglecting safety protocols. She cited statistics about workplace injuries and fatalities, emphasizing how companies like Crestwood had a responsibility to protect their employees. When corners are cut, Dr. Carter concluded, it puts lives at risk. Richard Caldwell listened intently, his pen moving quickly across his notepad. When it came time for cross-examination, he stood up, his tone polite but challenging. Dr. Carter, he began, isn't it true that accidents can happen even in the safest environments? Isn't it possible that some of these incidents were simply unfortunate coincidences? Dr. Carter shook her head firmly. Accidents do happen, yes, but when patterns emerge, like repeated equipment failures or ignored complaints, it points to systemic issues. These aren't coincidences, they're failures of management. Caldwell pressed further, attempting to undermine her credibility by questioning her familiarity with Crestwood specifically. But Karoline had anticipated this line of attack. During redirect examination, she guided Dr. Carter through a series of questions highlighting her extensive experience reviewing cases similar to Crestwood's. By the time Dr. Carter stepped down from the stand, her testimony had reinforced the plaintiff's argument that Crestwood had knowingly compromised worker safety. Next, Karoline called another key witness, Paul Evans, a mid-level manager who had recently left Crestwood under strained circumstances. Paul was nervous as he approached the stand, his hands gripping the railing tightly. Karoline greeted him warmly, her tone reassuring. "Mr. Evans," she began, "can you tell us about your role at Crestwood?" Paul nodded, swallowing hard. "I was a floor supervisor. My job was to oversee operations and make sure everything ran smoothly." "And during your time there," Karoline continued, "did you ever notice problems with how workers were treated?" Paul hesitated, glancing toward Caldwell and his team before answering. "Yes," he admitted finally. "There were issues. Workers weren't always paid correctly, especially if they worked overtime. And sometimes we didn't have enough staff, so people were forced to work longer hours than they should." Karoline nodded sympathetically. "Did you report these concerns to upper management?" "Yes, I did," Paul replied. "But nothing changed. In fact, I was told to stop raising these issues because it made the company look bad." The courtroom stirred, murmurs rippling through the rows of spectators. Judge Grayson leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Even Caldwell seemed uneasy, shifting in his seat as Karoline pressed on. "What happened after you raised these concerns?" she asked gently. Paul sighed, looking down at his hands. "Eventually, I was let go. They said it was for performance reasons, but I think it was because I kept speaking up." Karoline thanked him and returned to her seat, leaving the jury and everyone else to absorb his words. Paul's testimony painted a damning picture of a company willing to silence dissent rather than address legitimate grievances. When Caldwell tried to discredit him during cross-examination, accusing him of exaggerating or holding a grudge, Paul remained composed, sticking to his story. As the morning session drew to a close, Judge Grayson called for a short recess. Lawyers gathered their materials and spectators stretched or whispered among themselves. Outside the courtroom, reporters buzzed with excitement, speculating about the growing momentum in favor of the plaintiffs. Karoline, however, stayed focused. She knew the hardest part was still ahead. When the court reconvened, Karoline called her final witness of the day, Rachel Meyer, a former payroll administrator at Crestwood. Rachel was young, barely in her 30s, but her testimony carried significant weight. Under Karoline's guidance, she described discrepancies in employee paychecks, explaining how overtime hours were often omitted or recorded incorrectly. "It wasn't just one person," Rachel said quietly. "This happened regularly. Sometimes entire shifts would be erased from the system." The courtroom grew quieter as Rachel spoke, her voice trembling slightly but filled with conviction. She revealed that she had raised these issues multiple times with her superiors, only to be ignored. or worse, threatened with termination if she persisted. I felt trapped, she admitted, like I couldn't do anything to help the workers. Karoline let the moment linger, allowing the gravity of Rachel's words to sink in. Then she asked, "Did you keep any records of these discrepancies?" Rachel nodded, reaching into her bag to pull out a flash drive. "I saved copies of the payroll files," she explained. "I thought someday someone might need proof." A murmur swept through the gallery as Karoline accepted the flash drive, holding it up briefly for the court to see. This was the kind of evidence that could change everything. Richard Caldwell looked visibly shaken, his earlier confidence crumbling. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses, studying the flash drive with keen interest. Before adjourning for lunch, Judge Grayson instructed both parties to review the new evidence carefully and prepare for its introduction later in the trial. As the courtroom emptied, speculation ran rampant. Reporters scrambled to update their stories while spectators debated the implications of Rachel's bombshell revelation. Back inside, Karoline reviewed her notes, her mind racing. She knew the flash drive contained irrefutable proof of Crestwood's wrongdoing, but she also knew Caldwell would fight tooth and nail to discredit it. Still, she couldn't suppress a flicker of satisfaction. For the first time, she felt truly hopeful, not just for herself, but for the workers whose voices she was fighting to amplify. That evening, as she walked back to her apartment, Karoline allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges she couldn't yet predict. But she had accomplished something remarkable. She had turned the tide. What had started as skepticism from the judge, the jury, even the public, had shifted to cautious respect. People were beginning to see the truth behind the allegations, and Karoline knew she was closer than ever to achieving justice. Inside her apartment, she spread out her notes once more, preparing for the next phase of the trial. Tomorrow would bring fresh battles, new strategies, and perhaps even more surprises. But tonight she let herself rest, knowing she had done everything she could to give her clients a fighting chance. For Karoline, this case wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that no matter how powerful the opponent, fairness and integrity could prevail. It was about standing up for those who had been silenced, exploited, and forgotten. And as she sat there, surrounded by papers and coffee cups, she reminded herself why she had chosen this path in the first place. Tomorrow would come soon enough. But for now, she allowed herself to hope. The fourth day of the trial began with a heaviness that seemed to hang over the entire courthouse. The air felt charged, as though everyone knew they were approaching the climax of the story. Reporters crowded outside, their cameras flashing, as lawyers and spectators filed in. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat occupied. People leaned forward in anticipation, their eyes fixed on the front where Karoline Leavitt stood quietly, reviewing her notes. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell looked tense. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a visible unease. He whispered urgently to his team, his voice low but sharp. They nodded quickly, scribbling notes and flipping through documents. It was clear he was preparing for battle, knowing the stakes had never been higher. Judge Harold Grayson entered the room, his expression serious as he took his seat behind the bench. "Let's proceed," he said, his voice firm. Today the focus would be on the evidence. The flash drive Rachel Meyer had provided the previous day. This single piece of technology held the potential to unravel Crestwood Industries' carefully constructed defense. Karoline approached the judge's bench alongside Richard Caldwell, both presenting arguments about how the evidence should be handled. Caldwell objected vehemently, claiming the flash drive was inadmissible because it hadn't been disclosed earlier in the discovery process. But Karoline countered calmly, explaining that the information was only recently made available and was directly relevant to the case. Judge Grayson listened intently, his fingers steepled in front of him. After a long pause, he ruled in favor of admitting the evidence. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, turning to her, "you may present the contents of the flash drive, but I expect you to do so thoroughly and responsibly." Karoline nodded, her expression calm but resolute. She returned to her table and retrieved the flash drive, inserting it into a laptop connected to a projector. As the screen lit up, displaying rows of payroll data, the room fell silent. Even Caldwell stopped fidgeting, watching intently as Karoline began to explain what the files revealed. "These documents," she said, her voice steady, "show systematic manipulation of employee hours and wages. Entire shifts have been erased. Overtime has been deliberately excluded, and this isn't an isolated incident. It happened repeatedly, affecting hundreds of workers over several years." She highlighted specific examples, pointing out discrepancies in individual paychecks. One worker, she noted, had logged 70 hours in a week but was paid for only 40. Another showed no record of overtime despite working 12-hour days for months. Each example painted a clearer picture of exploitation and deceit. Caldwell tried to interrupt, raising objections and questioning the authenticity of the data, but Karoline remained unshaken, patiently addressing each concern. She explained that the files came directly from Crestwood's own system, backed up during routine operations. When Caldwell demanded proof of their origin, she produced emails showing Rachel Meyer's access to the payroll database, along with timestamps confirming when the backups were created. As the presentation continued, Judge Grayson leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He occasionally interrupted to ask clarifying questions, his tone probing but respectful. Even the jury members appeared captivated, their pens moving steadily across their notepads. By the time Karoline finished, the courtroom felt different, quieter, heavier, as though the truth had finally come to light. Richard Caldwell stood up next, attempting to cast doubt on the evidence. He argued that the files could have been altered or fabricated, suggesting Rachel Meyer might have tampered with them out of spite. But his words lacked conviction. For the first time, he seemed unsure, his usual charm faltering under the weight of the damning data. When Karoline rose for rebuttal, she dismantled his arguments methodically, pointing out inconsistencies and reinforcing the credibility of the evidence. By lunchtime, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Spectators whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief at the scale of Crestwood's misconduct. Reporters rushed outside to update their stories, while Caldwell retreated to a corner with his team, their faces grim. Karoline, meanwhile, stayed focused, eating a quick sandwich at her table as she reviewed her closing statement. When the afternoon session began, Judge Grayson announced that both sides would deliver their final arguments. Richard Caldwell went first, standing tall despite his obvious discomfort. He spoke passionately, trying to steer the narrative back to Crestwood's reputation as a pillar of the community. Yes, mistakes may have been made, he conceded, but Crestwood is not a villain. This company provides jobs, supports families, and contributes to the economy. We mustn't let isolated incidents overshadow its many contributions. His words were polished, delivered with practiced ease. But they rang hollow now, unable to compete with the mountain of evidence Karoline had presented. As he returned to his seat, even his own associates seemed deflated, sensing the tide had turned irreversibly against them. Then it was Karoline's turn. She stood slowly, taking a moment to gather herself before addressing the court. Her voice was soft but powerful, carrying the weight of everything she had fought for over the past 4 days. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is not about numbers or documents, it's about people. Hard-working men and women who trusted their employer to treat them fairly, who woke up early, worked late, and sacrificed time with their families, all because they believed in doing their best and yet they were betrayed." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she continued, her tone growing firmer. Crestwood Industries did not just make mistakes. They exploited these workers, erasing their efforts, denying them fair pay, and putting their safety at risk. They silenced anyone who dared to speak out. But today those voices are being heard. Today justice has a chance to prevail. Karoline turned to the jury, her eyes meeting theirs one by one. "You hold the power to send a message, not just to Crestwork, but to every company that thinks it can get away with exploiting its workers. You can say that enough is enough, that fairness matters, that integrity matters, that people matter." Her closing statement ended with a quiet strength, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Even Judge Grayson seemed moved, his expression thoughtful as he instructed the jury to begin deliberations. As the jurors filed out, the gallery erupted into murmurs, people discussing what they had witnessed. Some praised Karoline openly, calling her brilliant and fearless. Others simply sat in awe, processing the magnitude of what had unfolded. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed Karoline, asking for comments. She declined politely, saying only that she hoped the jury would make the right decision. Back inside, she packed up her materials, her movements deliberate but unhurried. She knew the verdict was out of her hands now, but she also knew she had done everything possible to fight for her clients. That evening, as she walked home, Karoline allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The road had been long and difficult, filled with challenges she hadn't anticipated. But she had persevered, driven by the belief that justice was worth fighting for. She thought about Daniel Harper, Maria Lopez, Rachel Meyer, and all the others who had trusted her to tell their story. They weren't just names on a lawsuit, they were real people whose lives had been impacted by Crestwood's actions. Back in her apartment, Karoline sat at her dining table, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. For the first time in days, there was nothing left to prepare, no strategy to refine. The waiting game had begun. She poured herself a cup of tea and gazed out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Tomorrow would bring the verdict and with it closure, or perhaps new beginnings. But tonight she let herself rest, knowing she had given her all. Whatever happened next, she had already made a difference. And sometimes, that was enough. The fifth day of the trial began with a sense of anticipation that filled every corner of the courthouse. People arrived early, eager to hear the jury's decision. Reporters set up their cameras and microphones outside, while inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. Spectators shuffled into their seats, flipping through newspapers or whispering among themselves. Karoline Leavitt sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked calm, but there was a tension in her posture, a mix of hope and uncertainty. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell and his team exchanged hushed conversations, their expressions unreadable. They had spent the previous evening strategizing, trying to prepare for any outcome. But no matter how much they planned, the verdict was out of their control now. Judge Harold Grayson entered the room, his presence commanding immediate silence. As he took his seat behind the bench, "Has the jury reached a decision?" he asked, his voice steady and authoritative. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with short brown hair, stood up slowly. "We have, Your Honor." A collective breath seemed to hold in the room as the bailiff handed the verdict slip to Judge Grayson. He scanned it briefly before nodding and passing it back. Turning to the foreperson, he said, "Please read the verdict." The foreperson cleared her throat and began. "On the charge of unpaid overtime wages, we find in favor of the plaintiffs. On the charge of unsafe working conditions, we find in favor of the plaintiffs. On the charge of retaliatory termination, we find in favor of the plaintiffs." Each word landed like a hammer, echoing through the silent courtroom. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the full weight of the verdict sank in. Crestwood Industries had been found guilty on all counts. Spectators exchanged astonished glances, some breaking into quiet applause. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail for their stories. Karoline felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she didn't allow herself to celebrate just yet. Instead, she turned to look at Daniel Harper, Maria Lopez, Rachel Meyer, and the other workers seated behind her. Their faces were lit with emotion, tears streaming down cheeks, smiles spreading wide, hands clasped tightly together. For them, this wasn't just a legal victory, it was validation. It was justice. Judge Grayson addressed the court next. "This is a landmark decision," he said, his tone serious but tinged with admiration. "It sends a clear message that companies cannot exploit their workers without consequence. Ms. Leavitt," he added, turning to Karoline, "you've done an exceptional job here. Your dedication and skill have brought attention to issues that often go unnoticed. I commend you." Karoline nodded politely, her expression humble. "Thank you, Your Honor. This victory belongs to my clients, not me. They're the ones who showed courage by speaking out." As the judge announced the damages awarded to the plaintiffs, millions of dollars in compensation and punitive fines, the room erupted into whispers once more. The amount was staggering, far exceeding what anyone had expected. Crestwood Industries would feel the financial blow deeply, but more importantly, its reputation was tarnished beyond repair. Richard Caldwell stood up stiffly, his face pale. He muttered something under his breath to his team before gathering his things and leaving the courtroom without another word. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by defeat. Outside reporters swarmed him, firing questions about the verdict, but he brushed past them silently, his head bowed. Meanwhile, Karoline was surrounded by well-wishers. Strangers approached her, shaking her hand and congratulating her on the win. Reporters pushed microphones toward her, asking for statements, but she kept her responses brief. "This case was never about me," she said firmly. "It was about standing up for people who deserve fairness and respect. I'm grateful the jury saw the truth." Later that afternoon, after the formalities had concluded, Karoline met privately with her clients. They hugged her, thanked her, and shared stories of how this victory would change their lives. Daniel Harper spoke about finally being able to provide for his family without fear. Maria Lopez talked about getting medical treatment for her injury. Rachel Meyer expressed gratitude for having her voice heard after years of feeling powerless. Karoline listened to each of them, her heart swelling with pride. These were the moments that made her career worthwhile, not the accolades or headlines, but the knowledge that she had helped make a difference. That evening, as she walked home, the city felt different. The streets were alive with energy, the air crisp and refreshing. For the first time in weeks, Karoline allowed herself to relax. Back in her apartment, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the lights of Cincinnati twinkle in the distance. Her phone buzzed, constantly with messages from friends, colleagues, and even strangers praising her work. She skimmed through them briefly, smiling at the kind words, but didn't respond right away. There would be time for that later. For now, she wanted to savor the quiet. Reflecting on the trial, Karoline realized how much she had grown during those 5 intense days. She had faced skepticism, pressure, and doubt, but she had persevered. She had proven to herself and to others that fairness and integrity could prevail, even against powerful opponents. And while this victory was significant, she knew it was just one step in a larger journey. The next morning, Karoline returned to her office, ready to dive into her next case. Her desk was already piled high with files and emails, reminders that there were always more battles to fight. But she greeted the workload with renewed determination. Each file represented someone in need, someone counting on her to help them navigate the complexities of the legal system. Over the following weeks, news of the trial spread widely. Articles appeared in newspapers and magazines, highlighting Karoline's role in exposing corporate exploitation. Some called her a hero, others praised her as a rising star in the legal world. Invitations to speak at conferences and events poured in, but Karoline declined most of them. She preferred to stay focused on her work, helping individuals rather than seeking fame. Still, the impact of the trial lingered. Workers across the country began sharing their own stories of mistreatment, inspired by the courage of Daniel, Maria, Rachel, and the others. Advocacy groups used the case as a rallying cry, pushing for stronger labor laws and protections. Even lawmakers took notice, introducing bills aimed at preventing similar abuses in the future. For Karoline, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition, it was knowing she had sparked change. She had reminded people that justice was possible, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. That belief fueled her passion, driving her to keep fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. One evening, months after the trial had ended, Karoline received a letter in the mail. It was from Daniel Harper, written in neat handwriting, on plain paper. "Dear Karoline," it began, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did for us. Because of you, my kids can sleep soundly at night, knowing their dad won't have to struggle anymore. You gave us hope when we thought there was none left. Please don't ever stop doing what you do. Karoline read the letter twice, tears welling up in her eyes. She tucked it into a drawer alongside other mementos from the case, a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. Outside her window, the city continued to move forward, its lights shining brightly against the night sky. Karoline, the road ahead was long, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But she faced it with confidence, knowing she had already made a difference, and knowing she would continue to do so, one case at a time.